Okay, good evening. Welcome, everyone. I hope you're all having a great day. Hi, I'm John Oxendorf, longtime professor here at MIT in architecture and also in engineering, and I'm directing the new MIT Morningside Academy for Design. We're just so thrilled with the way today has gone, and we're really grateful to our partners at Northeastern and Harvard and other places to make this all possible. And I do have a very quick announcement that right at the end of this session, the MIT Museum is hosting a reception, which is a fringe event. There are tickets for it. If you don't have tickets already, please try to get one because I think it's all the food and drink for like $30, which is kind of a deal. So hope to see you all there at the MIT Museum, which is just next to us, just behind us. I also, just a little bit of bookkeeping, a huge team here at MIT and at MAD did a lot of work to make today possible. So I want to give a special shout out to Adelaide, who's right here, to Mary, and to Marion, Roy, Anna, Jen, and to MIT AV, who's been great. So thanks everyone who contributed to today. And without further ado, I'm excited to jump right into our panel. So we've invited 4 leaders in design, research, designing with communities, not for communities, and so we're really excited to hear from them. And our format is we'll have 4 brief presentations, and then we'll have a little dialogue between our 4 panelists, and then we'll open it to the floor. So please do keep your questions for our panelists, and we'll leave plenty of time for discussion at the end. So first, I'm thrilled to introduce Richard Perez. He's the founding director of the Hasso Plattner School of Design Thinking at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He's come all the way from Cape Town to be here with us in Boston. And he's got experience both in the private sector and public sector and in higher ed, leading human-centered design together with business thinking, management, and strategy, and really tackling similar challenges to what we're tackling here at MAD, trying to elevate design across the whole university and have it as part of a fundamental skill set for educated students and citizens in the future. So, Richard, we're absolutely delighted to have you here, and I'm going to introduce all 4 panelists at once, and then we'll hear directly from Richard. Next, we have Sorbi Agarwal. She is a recent graduate in urban studies and planning. She's currently an urban technologist and planner at Sasaki here in Boston, and she's trained originally as an architect and planner in Bhopal, India, and then at TU Delft, I think, as well. And so looking forward to hearing from you, Sorbi. And then we'll hear from Amy Smith. Amy is a bit of a legend around MIT because 22 years ago, she founded MIT D-Lab, and she has a background in mechanical engineering, but I think she's happiest working in together with communities where she cannot be reached by email. And so so it's a minor miracle anytime we get to be with Amy here. But no, she's an incredible colleague and is really known around the world for her work in participatory design in a humanitarian context. And finally, we'll hear from Adi Mehrotra, who's a current MIT graduate student who's working in mechanical engineering, but also has a background in ECS and has been doing a lot of exciting work together with communities, in part together with D-Lab, which was founded by Amy. So without further ado, we've got an exciting panel for you, and I'll hand it over to you, Richard. Please join me in welcoming Richard Perez.
Thank you. Thought that. Fantastic. Thanks, John. Thanks for the introduction. Wonderful to be here. I was just reflecting with John the other day. I think a year ago I hadn't been to Boston once. Been to the States a couple of times, but in the last year I've been here 3 times, and every time really enjoyed it and really loving the conference, covering a lot of miles between the various venues, as I'm sure everybody else is. But it's wonderful to sort of see the different campuses and to listen to the community and the work that they do. So a little bit of background about myself and where I come from. I'm from the University of Cape Town. Recently started the Hasso Plattner D School Africa, which is very much focusing on building a design mindset and design capacity in the students that come through the university. And I'll talk a little bit about the reasons for that now. We have a new facility, and talking a lot with John about the similarities with the new facility being built here and what we have on the African continent. The University of Cape Town is a very traditional university. It's on the slopes of Table Mountain. It's about 200 years old, just coming under 200 years old, about 26,000 students, very traditional, commerce faculty, health science faculty, science faculty. And really our role as the D School is to try and touch on every single one of these students to start building a design mindset within the work that they do, the curricula that they follow, so that when they leave the university, they've got these critical mindsets. But what's very interesting about South Africa is just the diversity that we have. We have 12 official languages, and students come from all very different backgrounds that come together at the higher educational level. The reason we exist is through the funding from the Hasso Plattner Foundation. Started the D School at Stanford University back in 2003, and in Potsdam about 2007. And the foundation has always been curious and excited to see this way of thinking, this mindset, this sort of designing way of being, what could it look like in an African context, emerging market context, the complexity that we have, the diversity that we have, and really start to bring more of a global South perspective on design and design-led mindsets. Part of our mandate is very much to build an African narrative. I think a lot of the work, a lot of the literature, a lot of the vocabulary, a lot of the tools and techniques are global North-based. And in the brief period of the last 6 or 7 years that we've existed in South Africa, we've noticed a lot of limitations to these techniques and vocabulary and tools. So a big part of the work that we're starting to do is to build a network across the continent to start to learn from other regions, other universities, and start to build that sort of global South narrative. Really focusing on then allowing South Africa to start dealing with the challenges it has and using its own tools and techniques that it's created rather than those necessarily adopted from the global North. So just a little bit of focus around what we do at the D School, a very strong teaching and learning focus. I think we work with all the undergraduate students across the university. We get them into the D School, whether it's a student doing a law degree, get them in to start seeing the world through a design mindset in not so much the language, their own language per se, but just starting to bring their own culture into that work so that when they leave the university and they go back into their communities, they can actually start to work with those communities and bring in a sort of a design perspective in the challenges that they're going to face. We're recently building out the Discovery and Learning Lab, and sort of also one of the reasons I'm here at this conference is just from a research perspective where we can start to build our own knowledge for the work that we do. And then facilitation and support. A lot of design is based in practice, and so building spaces and places that we can actually test the work that we do in the teaching and learning. So we're kind of creating this ecosystem where we can practice, we can test, we can teach, and we can do research. And this goes across the continent with our partners. So what's interesting about South Africa, I think this is 2019, Time magazine, some of you may remember this, but South Africa is known as the world's most unequal country. It's got the highest Gini coefficient. And although we're 5 years in, we've just had our local national elections, I would say probably since 2019, that gap has even widened further. And so what you land up with students coming from various very impoverished communities, landing up in higher educational environments. They have the academic credentials, but it's a kaleidoscope of different cultures, different backgrounds, all coming together at a higher educational space. And that provides the challenges, but also great opportunities. These are students that have lived in very impoverished backgrounds, in places with no electricity, no running water, high levels of crime, high unemployment. South Africa South Africa has about 47% unemployment rate, and youth unemployment is about 65%. So huge challenges. And so you have young students coming from these backgrounds, often first in family, making it into a university educational environment. So also they don't have much support network. And so the opportunity for us as a D school is to work with students that come from these sorts of backgrounds, as well as those that come from the more privileged, and get them together and start teaching them how to think like designers, how to start solving challenges they've had when they were back in their environments, but also obviously challenges that they're going to face after they graduate. The students' body, I would say, is roughly, I would say about 60%, if not 50%, coming from these very impoverished backgrounds. Our focus around teaching and learning is to say, what are the learning and teaching experiences that we need to provide in order to build this capacity for students to be able to go back into their communities, back into their cultures, to be able to work with their friends and families or the networks that they have, and help to solve their own challenges. So one of the things that we look at, and this is the link back into the design world, is graduate attributes. And if you look at the complexity of the challenges that not only the world faces, but certainly South Africa, World Economic Forum every 5 years brings out top 5 skills, or top 10 skills that we're going to need in any workplace. And we see these as foundational skills. These are critical skills that in resource-constrained environments, and in fact, even resource-rich environments, that we're going to need as human beings. And one of the reasons we exist, and one of the reasons that we have gained a lot of traction in the work that we do at the University of Cape Town, is that when you start to overlay some of the design skills over there's almost a direct overlap. And this is really our hook into the traditional education, traditional curricula across the university. So if our mandate is to start teaching students these design capabilities and design skills, how to show up to a problem, what does that look like from a pedagogy perspective? We're not trying to train them to be graphic designers and furniture designers and vehicle designers. We're trying to teach them the design skills so that when they face these grand challenges, whether it's at home, whether it's at work, whether it's back in their community, that they have been given the bare essential skills to be able to take on some of those challenges. And this is where the designing with and the designing for and the designing by starts to come in. But as you can imagine, a lot of these students have had no exposure at all to design or design education. In fact, many of the languages in South Africa, design isn't even a word, but yet they can do design. So we have to be quite careful on how we introduce these types of skills, and especially through the carrier of design. So at the D School, we have students that come in. We give learning experiences. We start to teach them the foundations of design. And I'll talk a little bit about the learning journey that we take them through. Because at the end of the day, as I mentioned, we're not necessarily trying to turn them into professional designers, but we're working on a mindset, teaching them a mindset, a way of being, a way they're going to show up to a problem. Design's not in here, but the design that sits here in the heart, and how we can get people to co-create. And I'll talk a little bit more about the concept of Ubuntu just out. So these are sorts of challenges that we get students to work on during their undergrad or postgrad as an extracurricular that come into the D School. Typical wicked problems, grand challenges that the students go through a learning journey where we can start to build this mindset, this sort of attitude towards the problems and challenges, so they can start to help themselves in the world that they exist. And it can be anything from how might men contribute towards stopping the violence against women and girls, so a lot of gender-based activities, all the way through to designing public transports, better public transport systems. And so it really varies depending on the challenges that we source from industry, public and private sector. And really, ultimately, what we're trying to teach is this mindset. There's tools and there's methods, there's processes, there's the practice, but what we're really trying to do is teach them mindset. This is foundational, which you can then apply to almost every aspect. And a lot of it is underpinned by the concept of co-creation. So I'll pick out just a few, but something like just navigating uncertainty. You know, we get law students coming through, or students from accounting backgrounds, finance, and just getting to be comfortable that there is no data from the future. And in fact, even the data from the past, we can't really rely on anymore. So how do you cope with that? How do you actually start to build that confidence, that efficacy to navigate a world where the data doesn't make that much sense? I think the human-centeredness at the bottom, key to design, human-centered design, a key aspect. A lot of the students they jump straight into solution mode. They don't even think that there are actually people out there that they need to consider, and moving into a space of co-creation and designing with others. I think one of the one which drives a lot of the students the most is the be driven to make a difference. You find that students are passionate about making a difference. They want to see South Africa succeed. They want to see Africa succeed. So they are heavily invested in wanting to see the country and their communities turn a corner. So we need to tap into that inner energy. So it's very important to bring that into the process. So the journey that we take the students through, and this is where it gets onto the topic of the designing with and the designing for. The first step for us really is that the students often don't even know that they have the capacity to design. You know, we focus on the democratization of design. Our belief is that everybody has the capacity to create, and every human has the capacity to build and make and design something. So it's the first thing we need to unlock, is to get the students to realize that although they maybe are following a traditional health science education, that they do have that inner capacity. It's about building confidence and belief and efficacy, that if they see a challenge or problem, that they can do something about it. And a lot of the time that we land up, that's in a space where the students design without. So they're fantastic, I can solve this problem, and off they go into their little corner and they do their things. We need to break out of that mold get them to break out of that mold quite quickly. Then we move into a space where we teach them the importance of social systems and the complexity of that. And there's actually people out there that we need to engage with. And we move into what we typically refer to as Design Thinking 101, which for us is still a form of designing for. You're going out there, doing some inquiry, bringing information back, you're making some sense as a team, but you're going backwards and forwards. You're not purely engaging with the community. So these are sort of stepping stones that we need to take the students through, because we feel that the following steps are, you can't just jump into that level of practice. We've got to scaffold them, but we've got to take them through the whole journey, because if we leave them along the way, it can get quite challenging. So then we move them into the space of co-creation, where they're actually in their communities working with, and whether it's a work community or whether it's a home community or it's back in their townships, working with the community, designing with, solving the challenges that they have, and it could be anything from a challenge around sanitation through to transportation, through to gender-based violence. It doesn't really matter what it is in their community, but at least they're working with people. And then the next step forward is where the communities start to build that capacity themselves. And we talk to, and this is a space we talk about going into designing with and designing by. And in South Africa, we have this philosophy called Ubuntu, which is about I am because we are. And so it's all about the human connection. And so that social interaction and design is such a critical part of the African culture. And it has to be brought in. And you don't find that in the previous steps. We've got to take it, if you really want to unlock the potential and capacity of African culture, we've got to get them into that space where they're designing with each other and connecting with each other. So for us, it's about taking students right the way through that journey and essentially making every student a change maker in the world. So very brief case study, just to sort of land this a bit. Nsako was he was an electromechanical engineer at University of Cape Town. He grew up in the townships. He came through the D School and is an alumni of the D School about 4 years ago. He was staying with his aunt. This is the environment he grew up with, and then he found himself at university doing electromechanical engineering. But his family lives in these conditions, and he was staying with his aunt, and they continuously got burgled. You find that the security people in informal settlements, they can't afford formal security, and also you'll find security companies will not go into these environments. It's just too dangerous for them. And then through his research and the work that he did and working with this community, he realized that from the community side, that security had been, the community side of security had been lost through sort of traditional Western approaches, and that in Africa, it's actually about connecting each other, and you have the sort of communal security systems. And so developed a product which actually lives inside these informal dwellings, and it goes off and it tells the neighbors that something is wrong, and the neighbors all come running. So it's all about bringing the neighbors into and bringing in the local community into your space. What was interesting about this process is that he combined not only the designing for piece, but also the with and also the by into his solution really at the end of the day. And I think that was the beauty about his takeaway from this experience. He had the engineering, which is very much designing for, but the human-centered designing with, but then bringing the community in as a critical part of coming up with a solution. And thank you very much. That's the end of the talk. If you'd like, there's a QR code just to go to our website if you'd like to know more, but otherwise, yeah, we can chat a little bit later. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard. And I will go directly into our next talk by Sorby. Please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Surbi. I work as an urban technologist in Plattner, and my work really is focused on helping cities, governments, and communities build capacity to engage with technology. And a big focus of that work is on equity and serving underserved populations. And so that's kind of where the idea of digital equity comes from. So globally, there's, as we all know, a huge push now for digital tools to support all functions, but also in this context, planning and design processes. However, that there's a big risk in that transition of exacerbating these inequities that exist in the systems, of exacerbating socioeconomic marginalization. And so digital equity becomes a crucial foundation to think about how technologies and data can be engaged within cities, but also enforce equity in the process. So I kind of tend to think about digital equity in these three realms. There is the idea of connectivity, there is the idea of capacity, and then there is opportunity. So connectivity very basically is about, are you able to connect to digital resources, infrastructure, devices? Capacity is, do you have the knowledge to engage with them? Do you understand these tools? But opportunity is really kind of where the juice of the work lies. And that's about, do you have the ability to engage with this thing meaningfully and unlock better socioeconomic opportunities or even like better quality of life? And how do we talk about that? So there's the idea of digital capacity building. And thanks to the Morningside Academy, I was able to do this research in India during my time at MIT. And I worked on addressing digital equity through meaningful connectivity in urban India. So to understand the context of what the work was, in India, there was a nationwide expansion of 4G connectivity starting in 2017, and cellular-first internet access became the social norm. Like all the cost barriers to internet access were broken, and people who don't have sometimes access to basic amenities also now always had a smartphone, a cell phone. It's both the aspiration for technology, but also the affordability changing that really changed that access. This also led to a huge digital evolution. There were a lot of apps and like applications and digital innovations in the country. For instance, there was this cash innovation that happened. So, tackling lack of like formal banking, there were these apps, and it's called the Unified Payment System, that came into place that like small vendors, like a street side vegetable seller could also use and tap into for the payment system, and sort of tapping onto the informal economy and formalizing some of that using technology and accessibility. This really kind of changed how people in India, particularly in urban India, were engaging with their environment. But that also brings the question of what are the key determinants in achieving equity and barriers for marginalized communities in this context? And how can community-centric interventions, so designing with communities, effectively bridge the digital divide and foster inclusive socioeconomic development? And so kind of looking at another version of the diagram we were looking at initially, comes the idea of meaningful connectivity. And again, there's the idea of connectivity, which thinks about like infrastructure. There's the idea of accessibility, which is capacity. But then there's the idea of communicability, people's ability to engage with and access socioeconomic opportunities using internet access in this very case. So to do this work, I engaged with some community partners because the sense was that they would have the best understanding of what was happening on ground, and we're doing some of this work for using digital connectivity and digital tools for socioeconomic improvements. And so I worked with these three NGOs in India. One's called Addressing the Unaddressed, Digital Empowerment Foundation, and Sheltered Associates. And I'm going to walk us through some cases of what I discovered when I engaged with their projects, and how they were using technology, but also like very much on-ground capacity building for this work. If you look up an address on Google Maps, especially in developing countries, sometimes you'll see a combination of like 6-7 digits, like PK, XY plus another 4-digit combination that is used to map addresses where such formal street addresses don't exist. And Google did this global project of using their geocodes. So those are Google Plus codes, of using those as addresses for people in informal settlements. So, a lot of times these residents go by just the area, like Surbi lives in mid-Cambridge and you have to go and find Surbi there. Or if you had to deliver a parcel there, right? It's really difficult. So without address, you can imagine all the issues of like banking or delivery of goods, dignity of life that you lose without having a formal address, right? So this project was really focused upon getting these address plates to these people. If you can see in that image, there's that small number plate on top of that house. And this example here is about a businessman who lives in an informal settlement in Navi Mumbai, who, using that address now, was able to scale his business, get access to manufacturing goods and opportunities, and kind of engage with the power of like an address, right? I reviewed this particular technology implementation in 2 cities. So there was a project in Kolkata and a project in Navi Mumbai. And there were some differences in approaches. And this is really where the piece of like community empowerment comes into place. So technology isn't like a solution to any problem in itself, right? Like Google Maps is just like an address tool. The real success versus kind of, I wouldn't call it failure, but like criticism on the other project was, in one project, in the project in Mumbai, the focus of the NGO was really about going door to door, talking to the people, explaining to them how to use this address, making sure they were using it for things, doing like a constant check. In the second case, the focus was more on implementation, also just because of how they got their funding and such. So they wanted to cover more areas first and then build capacity later. But that ended up kind of, leadership changes, funding sources change. And so if you don't do this like iterative process of bringing the community along with you, then whatever the solution is, however brilliant it is, it's not really going to take hold. So that was a big learning from that work. This is another project. So this is the third foundation I engaged with. It's called the Digital Empowerment Foundation, and they're doing fascinating work across the country. They're working on setting up mesh networks in rural areas where there's no internet networks. In urban areas, their focus is really, again, thinking about now that there's access and affordability, how do you use that and how do you leverage that to enable communities to access opportunities? So in this case, they are training community members, so trusted people within the communities, and teaching them how to help people to access digital services, right? So they make social entrepreneurs, that's what they call them. They equip them with like a small setup, they give them like a printer, they give them a computer, and they teach them how to help people sign on for a digital ID, for a bank account. And these people also become more entrepreneurial in the process. So this lady, Orti, that I interviewed, she also, in that small setup that she has, started providing tutoring services to middle school people or kids in the mornings. And then she does that entrepreneurship center in the evening. So it's like called a e-mitra, e-friend, this kind of a center which helps people in the community access digital services. So it's like community trust, leadership by people in the community, and really facilitating that learning and capacity. The meaningfulness, in my perspective, in digital divide bridging really comes upon focusing on holistic capacity building and very high engagement with the community, because that's where the change can really happen. And that led me to develop a little manifesto for meaningful connectivity. So what are kind of the main ideas in this manifesto? It's about recognizing that digital equity is a fundamental right. I strongly believe in this, increasingly so with the propagation of this whole digital transformation that's obviously with AI and everything, it's going to take over more. It's not going anywhere. But really centering meaningful connectivity in the work, thinking about prioritizing capacity building for communities in the work. Who are going to be the beneficiaries of this work? How do we bring along everybody, the marginalized sections of the society? And then how do we do that, right? So thinking about the role of like civil society organizations, NGOs, all of these civic actors which work on ground and help bridge gaps between like communities and organizational stakeholders. Thinking about enabling communities to empower themselves to create innovation, and then also kind of from in the governmental system, doing policy reform to support all of these changes and this kind of transformation, and ultimately foster a culture of digital inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Surbi. And now we'll go directly to Amy Smith. Please join me in welcoming Amy Smith.
Good afternoon and welcome everybody. For those of you for whom it's your first time at MIT, welcome to our campus. Not all our buildings have this great a view, but I'm very glad you could join us here. Great. So as John said, I work at D-Lab at MIT, and our mission is to advance collaborative approaches and practical solutions working with people around the world to address issues of global poverty. Oops. So many people ask us, what does the D stand for in D-Lab? And the pillars of D-Lab are around development, design, and dissemination. And the foundation is that we do this through dialogue and discovery. This D-Lab works through both academics, research, and also doing field work. And so this is sort of the crux of what we do. So I thought that today's session I would term in terms of the prepositions of design, because prepositions matter. There are a lot of cartoons that emphasize this. This one was a little bit grim, but I thought it made the point. Right. Okay. So the first prepositional question I thought we could ponder together is this idea of design for development or design as development. And this is looking at, is it the products of design which are leading to development, or can it also be the process of design that is leading to development, right? So how the users are engaged in the overall development of the technology really matters. And at D-Lab, that's one of the core beliefs, that it is both the process and the products of design that will lead to transformation in a community. So many of you may have seen this before, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in which are the things we need to live sort of happy, fulfilled lives, and can be categorized into three basic areas. One is around our basic needs, the other psychological needs, and then finally our self-fulfillment needs. And when we look at this through a design lens, I would argue that using technology satisfies our basic needs. A grain mill can produce flour for food. A pump can produce water for drinking. A house provides shelter against the elements, right? So those are the, technology satisfies those basic needs. However, designing technology really addresses some of those higher level needs. We work together in design teams, and that builds relationship, not only within our team, but relationship with the user, right? And that's an important aspect of our psychological needs, right? We feel like design can, well, let me just check. How many of you have ever made anything in your lives, right? And how do you feel like when it works? It's pretty awesome, right? Like we feel happy, we feel joy, we feel like we can do anything, right? And so this idea of designing technology as being a way to meet higher level needs of human development, I think is really important. And I don't think it's considered enough in the development enterprise. Okay. So at DLab, moving into some more prepositions of design, we act out in several different paradigms of design. So design for, where the designers engage with the users, interact with them, gain empathy with the users, and take their user's experience and place it at the center of the design process. We also do co-creation and collaborative work together with communities through our fieldwork and through our design summits. And then we also promote design by the end users through our creative capacity building. And in that case, we teach the design process so that the end users are transformed into becoming designers and feel empowered to create technologies and designs that address challenges in their own lives. So at DLab, we've developed a participation framework that looks at the role that the end users have in the design process. And I think it's important because a lot of times we may think we're doing design with when it might actually still be designed for. And so we characterize the roles of those stakeholders by looking at whether they're providing information, sharing opinions, and giving feedback, or having a role in decision-making, or having a role in the leading and direction of a project. So if we look at this idea of consultation or design for, this is when the users can provide their input, their opinions, their feedback to a process. And it might be through a single interaction, it might be through a two-way conversation, or it might be through multiple conversations where they can give feedback, see how that gets incorporated into the design, and comment on that. We also can look at the idea of partnership, which is design with, and this can take on two ways as well. The one being collaboration, where people's roles are defined by their expertise. So the engineer does the technology work, the social scientist may look at the human factors aspect of things, the community member provides the context. And then the other way of looking at it is co-creation, where all stakeholders and all members of the team bring their full experience to the design process. Finally, the idea of leadership. In one case, you have empowerment, where the design team is still helping the community members to design for themselves, but doing so in an empowering way. Or it could be that the tools are put in place and the community completely owns and runs the process as well. So this is a framework that lets us think about design. And I think it's important to think about this framework when we think about the way users are engaged in the design process. And a seat at the table is not enough. If someone comes to the table, but they don't feel comfortable and confident sharing their opinions, then it's not really design with, right? If they don't have the skills to meaningfully contribute to a design process, then it's not really design with. If they don't have the power to influence decisions and direction, then it's not really design with. So I think it's really important to think about what it means by design with. And it isn't just inviting people to join the table, it's really looking at how they can make meaningful contributions. And for me, that's why design by is so important. It's a prerequisite to effective design with. People have to have the confidence and capabilities to join effectively in the design process. Right. So at DLab, we've developed a program which we call creative capacity building. And it's a training program which works with community members and teaches them the design process and takes them through that process to create solutions to challenges that they've identified for themselves. So part of it is teaching the design process, and we go through a version of the design process that's been developed so that it doesn't require literacy, so people of any educational background can contribute. And we also teach prototyping skills so that people have confidence in being able to take their ideas and reducing them to practice. This is particularly important. A lot of the work we do is in sub-Saharan Africa, and traditionally women don't have a lot of use of tools in their background. So one of the things we try to do is we try to teach people how to work with metal, how to work with wood, and to create technologies that can impact their lives in a positive way. I have one of those here. So one of the things that we like to do is we, as we're teaching people how to use different tools and how to work with sheet metal, they're able to take a single piece of sheet metal and make a device that looks like this. And in so doing, they learn how to use hammers, pliers, tin snips, screw files, etc. And this is a device which can be used to remove the kernels of corn from an ear of corn. This is a highly labor-intensive process, which not only takes a lot of time, but it also can be quite painful as you remove all the kernels from the ear. Often when I give this talk in Africa, I'll ask, how many of you shell your corn by hand? And many hands go up. But how many of you shell your corn? Yeah, not so many, but let me tell you, it's a great technology. I'll just show you how it works. So you just put the corn in, and you can see, whoa, even if you don't do this for hundreds of hours. But now imagine that you're a woman who does spend hundreds of hours every year removing this corn by hand. And in less than 45 minutes, you can make a device that is 10 times as fast as doing it by hand and is not painful. Right? That transforms the way that you think about yourself, and it transforms the way you think about technology. Yeah. I always say everybody loves a corn sheller. So in teaching these prototyping and hands-on skills is a critical part of building that confidence and having that transformative impact. Right. So we are doing CCB in about almost 25 countries around the world. You'll notice a lot of them are concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, but we do have places that we're working in Asia and Latin America as well. I wanted to just share a few quotes that came out of a project that we did in South Sudan that was looking at this creative capacity building, not only as a way to teach people design, but also to bring people together. Many of you, I'm sure, know that South Sudan is a country in conflict. And so we worked to use this collaborative design as a way to bring together people of basically the warring factions within South Sudan. And we had some remarkable success with that project. So first of all, there was this personal transformation. So this is Monica in the front there, and she said that I felt happy and proud of myself for having developed a wheel cart, which is sort of a wheelbarrow, which can be used to move goods around the community. Some of my friends asked me where I got it from, and I told them that my team and I developed it. They were shocked and proud of the great work. So not only was she impacted by creating this technology, but other people's view of her also was impacted. Okay. And then just the utility of the technologies that are developed. So one of the men said, I felt proud when I made the technology. Since I made the technology, I have not slept hungry for days now. And then about bringing people together. In fact, I met a lot of friends from here where we have sat and eaten together. Some of them I used to see as enemies, but now we are tight friends, and it is the CCB that did that. Many participants said that working together on a technology that benefited both groups was critical in bringing them together, much more so than sitting in circles and just talking about peace and what it looks like. They really appreciated this practical aspect of things. And then finally, again, personal transformation on a deeper level. One of the young men said that he was expecting the training to change me from being bad to good. Like I said before, that I was a raider. This is a cattle raider who stole cattle from the neighboring tribes. But now I am a scientist with technologies that have not been there before. So this is the type of transformation that leads to, I think, positive and sustainable change within a community, but it also leads to people being more comfortable contributing to a co-creative design with process. They now come to the table with confidence, with improved capabilities, understanding the vocabulary of design. And I just wanted to finish with a very brief example from one of our co-creative design summits that was held in a refugee camp in northern Uganda that brought together people from about 20 different countries working together. And those refugees had all taken part in a creative capacity building workshop. So they were very active creators of the technologies that were developed. One of these technologies was a pedal-powered peanut butter maker. And here is the technology in the marketplace. In the back, you can see Betty, who was a member of the team who uses this technology in her shop. Here you can see buckets of peanut butter being produced. And every time I go back to northern Uganda, I can still buy peanut butter from Betty at her shop. So I think this speaks to the power of prepositions when you're talking about design, right? So I believe that design by is an incredibly important thing for it to enable design with and allowing people to, design for themselves and other members of the community. So with that, I will say thank you and please.
Thank you so much, Amy. I always learn so much from you. So now our final panelist, please join me in welcoming Adi Mehrotra.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, where's the clicker? Ugh, thank you. Sorry. Hi, everyone. My name is Adi. I'm a graduate student here at MIT in the mechanical engineering department. I do a lot of energy research, but over the 6 years I've been at MIT, D-Lab has been like a second home to me. So thank you, Amy and Anna and everybody on that team for providing such a wonderful space for students to do awesome work like this. But I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about a project I was doing with a nonprofit in Ghana over the past few summers. That nonprofit is called Moving Health, which is designing for healthcare access in rural Ghana. So briefly, the healthcare system in Ghana works a little bit differently than the healthcare system in the US. It's kind of a tiered referral system. So essentially you have these like little community centers for local healthcare, and you get referred to higher levels of healthcare as you go through the system, and each level has more and more advanced care that is available to you. But also one key problem here is that as you get to higher levels of care required, the centers become rarer and rarer across the country. So like teaching hospitals, there's only like 7 to 10 of them in the entire country, and they're quite far away from these rural communities. So if you live in the cities, it's easy to access, but if you're like farther away, it's very difficult to get there. And around the time in 2018, there was this crazy study that came out that was like there's 50 ambulances in the entire country of Ghana. And for a country of like approaching 34 million people, that's nuts, right? Like how are people getting to the hospital? And the answer was, well, they're not really, so transportation became a huge problem that Moving Health was trying to solve, and came to the conclusion that like many of the fatalities that were resulting from the lack of healthcare access were totally preventable. It's just people couldn't get to the hospital in time, right? So you might be like, okay, we should just buy more ambulances. That doesn't work, and here's why. In rural Ghana, like the roads are quite a state, as many of you might know. We were actually taking a Mitsubishi Outlander around there while we were driving around. It's a pretty heavy-duty off-road car, right? We broke the front left suspension. Like that's how bad the roads are, So this is what an ambulance looks like after just a year in the field up there. Like engine is shot, all the tires are broken, and so we were like, okay, so this is not going to work. And in addition to this, like it requires an extensive amount of training to operate an ambulance. You need paramedics. The ambulance is super expensive. Honestly, like that's $120,000 vehicle, right? At minimum. So what Moving Health does is they design these low-cost tricycle ambulances to connect, especially the rural communities, to the nearest urban population center for access. Specifically, starting in regards to maternal health care, but expanding to more like vaccine delivery and other forms of healthcare as well. The cool part about this, though, is a lot of the challenge here is what do you take out of an ambulance to give you like the minimum viable product, right? So there was two parts here. First, when it comes to designing with communities, Moving Health realized okay, we need to build the platform on top of a vehicle that everybody already knows how to drive. We don't need to have special training and things like that. So they started with this platform called a Moto King, which is pretty common in that area of Ghana. And also, all of this stuff that they came up with in here was basically directly requested by the people who live in the communities where the problem is prevails the most. So there was things like basic first aid that we kind of knew we would need to put in there, seats for family members, a stretcher so the people can lie down. But the interesting one for me was this IV drip that one of the nurses specifically requested from the communities. It was their idea. They were like, we need an IV drip to provide saline during these long 3-hour transportations. That's something we hadn't even thought of, But the coolest part, I think, by far about Moving Health, in addition to everything that I've already mentioned that's really cool, is and some of the stuff that I was more working on with them and I can talk about more, is these ambulances, parts are sourced and they're entirely built in Ghana by the communities in which they are stationed. So they're not built in Accra, they're not built in Kumasi, they're built all the way up in Tumu, where access to healthcare is a huge challenge. So I want to talk a little bit about how we do this, because this is a massive challenge, and there's a couple stories I can tell you here. So is anyone familiar with Swami Magazine in Ghana? Yeah, so anyone who's been there, best place on earth, convince me otherwise. So imagine a multi-acre spread of just car parts and machines and artisans working on vehicles. This is where cars go to die and be reborn into the craziest things you've ever seen. When I say every single part of the car is reused, I'm not even joking. The way they're able to reuse things in this place is crazy. But what this means is this is the best place for us to go to learn not only what parts do we have access to if we want to build an ambulance, but also what techniques are people in country already using to build things, and how can we use that to build an ambulance that we know can be built in country, but also be serviceable in the country, because serviceability is a huge challenge where these ambulances break down and people are I don't know what an ECU is. My engine has a carburetor. How do I fix that, right? And we need to build systems that they can service themselves in these remote communities. I want to tell you a fun story about these two wonderful individuals. So this is Ambra and this is Sufianu. And they both live in Tumu, one of the communities that we work directly with. I have goofier pictures of them, but I thought I'd give you the nice ones for this presentation. But they're wonderful individuals. They're artisans, they've lived there their whole lives, and they're the chief engineers of Moving Health, which is really cool that we have chief engineers who are from the communities that we're working with. The first story I want to tell you is about this. This is, actually, I'll get to what it is in a second, but basically we were in Tumu and we were working on building one of the first prototypes of the ambulance, and the power goes out, as it goes out quite often in those areas. And so I decided okay, I'm gonna go sit down, I'm gonna draw in my notebook, I'm gonna plan out things that we're gonna do for the next couple hours or so while we wait for the power to come on. And Isaac, who was the Moving Health country director, was he was oh, I'm a little stressed, we wanna get the ambulance done soon, things that we wanna go out and test and all this kind of stuff. And I sit down and I'm drawing and I hear this sound like the earth is being plowed. And I look around and Sufianu has dragged out this diesel engine out from the back of some truck. And some other, his name is Bebe, he came over with a motor. And they hooked these two things together and they're okay, we need to weld right now. We're just gonna make our own electricity. So they hooked up this generator to this motor and they hooked up the motor to an arc welder and they just sat there welding. And I was just saying that I just would have never thought to do that, I would have not been I'm just gonna make my own electricity now. And I thought this was a really cool example of their creativity, One other cool, so stick welder, generator, diesel engine, Thomas Edison. So another cool kind of discussions we were having with people in the communities when we went to test the ambulances, one of the nurses actually came up to us and was like, it would be really cool if we had a stretcher that had wheels, because we don't want to be lifting up the patients every time to put them in the ambulance. And also there's a risk that we drop them if we, so like this is a $100,000 stretcher from America. So we were like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. But like we showed this to Ambra and Sufiana and we're like, what did you come up with? What can we make something like this? How could we do this? And after a couple design iterations with them, they came up with this. Anyone want to guess how much that cost? Yeah, isn't that awesome? All right. Does anyone want to guess how much that costs? You're close. It's 350 CDs, which is about $40 US. And it's totally functional, right? Like in terms of like anything we need to do. And the bed part is made of leather too. And that's included in that $350 CD price. Like that's crazy, right? That's awesome. So like go them. They're wonderful. Cool. Oh, we're going. Yes. Awesome. So I want to talk a little bit about the research we're currently doing with Moving Health, because Moving Health has a lot of ambulances deployed right now, and what's the next step for us. And this is a really interesting case study, I feel like, because this is usually very like separate from what we usually talk about when it comes to developing communities. We're talking about design for energy independence now. So the problem is in Ghana, because of various global conflicts, oil price fluctuations have been all over the place. So on certain days, like it is just intractable to run the ambulance. So one of the things we've been exploring is like, can we use battery electric vehicles? If we convert them to battery electric vehicles, can we reduce the price of the operation to Moving Health? So that's an interesting question of how do we design that with the communities, right? So then we ask the question, who are we designing with? And a lot of that time, the biggest issue with these vehicles is, of course, safety is a big one. And also serviceability are the big areas where we're talking about in terms of designing for electrification. And the third one is the grid. How do we charge these things, especially in these rural communities? So the three groups that we're working with, first are the workers who actually put up the grid lines. They can tell us how much power it takes and when we need to drop new grid lines, how expensive that is. And that's the first group we're working with. The second group is this place in Swami Magazine called ITTU, which is a training center. They do a lot of training for how to service the newer vehicles that aren't carbureted, have engine control units. They deal with a lot of safety, and they can help us consider, like, when we're designing these ambulances, we're working what kind of training programs do we need to put into place to make sure they can service them in country safely with high voltage systems and things like that. I'm just going to end with a couple of fun statistics. So this year, Moving Health has given 75,000 people access to healthcare in 1 year. And they have built a total of 15 ambulances in the community that they're working in, and I thought that was pretty cool. So thank you for your time. Sweet.
Thank you so much, Adi, and all of our panelists. So at this point, I'd like to ask the four of you to come to the front, and we can have a conversation.
Wait for him. I'll be.
You met John.
Yeah. I guess I'm stuck in the middle. So, there's so much I could ask all of you, but I guess I'd like to start by asking if any of you have any questions for each other now that you've heard each other talk about your work, or any comments you'd like to make on each other's talk. So,
well, I think the one thing that really sticks out to me is that, we often talk about under-resourced communities, but they're actually incredibly resourceful, given the need. And it's just about, I think, unlocking that creativity. It's definitely been a common theme for me, which has come through in all those projects. I guess the question I have is, how do we get people to that point that they can believe in the fact that can make a difference. Yeah, so we're curious, especially with the ambulance project around, was there a catalyst which got them into, okay, we can do this ourselves? We're not just going to take these machines which just don't deal with our local conditions. This is technology. What got them to the point to say, well, we actually have to make it ourselves?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because I think it has to do a lot with narrative, from both in the country and outside the country. Like, I think a lot of the time, the narrative around development is that these communities are helpless and we have to somehow save them, right? But I think it's at some point, at least for moving health, a lot of the time what they were doing is they just gave them the resources to solve the problem a little bit and stepped back. Like, you give them the challenge and you see what they come up with. And especially that was the case with the stretcher, where we just showed them the stretcher and we're like, okay, well, what would you do? And at that point, it was a bit helpful in the design process for the nonprofit itself, which had a bit of funding to come in and provide the funding to purchase materials and things like that. But then it was up to them to do the actual design process and, kind of an unconstrained fashion.
And Amy, you want to add anything? Because Moving Health did come out of D-Lab originally, right?
It did come out of D-Lab originally. And in fact, they provide projects for our classes on a almost annual basis, so that it continues to be connected to D-Lab, which is great. I feel that I don't know if I was the only hand that went up when you asked about knowing Swami Magazine, but it is true that Ghana is a country that has a unique set of resources around not only this manufacturing center, but also manufacturing centers on a smaller scale around the world, around the country, and this idea of believing in the confidence of those manufacturing centers to provide locally is something that, first of all, I do think the narrative within the country is that those magazines can produce things all over the country, right? So it's more of an external narrative rather than an internal narrative. But I do think that that's one of the most valuable things we teach our students at D-Lab is the amount of creative capacity which exists and the degree to which sometimes it is already unleashed and sometimes there's a few levers that you can pull to release it. And it's not always resources and money that pull those levers, right? Sometimes it's just a boost in confidence. Sometimes it is a connection with someone else. And I think that those are some of the things that you can do when you actually go to the field. And if you recall, when we talked about the foundation of D-Lab being the discovery and dialogue, it's one of the reasons why we feel it's so important for our students to get out there. And I think it's similar with your students, right? That they're, probably most of the students who get to University of Cape Town, they've been kind of the cream of the crop in terms educationally, right? So, but to provide that access to go back to the community and discover, what is it like for people who were not as fortunate as me to, succeed in education, because it's not always easy to go through the South African educational system if that's not the way you learn effectively. So again, being able to have that re-entry into the community and that same discovery and dialogue, which I think it's necessary to inform the design with aspect of things.
The other thing that I kept thinking about through all of your talks is how in many universities, especially in STEM-dominant universities like MIT, the problem spaces we set for students are often the kinds of spaces that big corporations are working in, who have resources to have big teams of engineers. And these are much more interesting problem spaces, and so just thinking about how we can begin to shift some of the educational pursuits within universities so that we are addressing more social challenges strikes me as something that all of you are engaged in some way. So I don't know, maybe I'd love to open it up to the floor, but maybe my my last thought for the panel is there anything, when you reflect on your own education or the educational structures, how do you think about the way we frame design spaces within universities? And are you optimistic about the directions we're going?
I mean, I can start. I'll take the elder's privilege here. So I was an undergrad at MIT in 1980 to 1984. Last week, I think, yeah. And at the time in mechanical engineering, most of the jobs you could get were with defense or with car companies. And I don't drive. I still don't drive. And I don't bomb people. I still don't bomb people, right? And at the time, biomedical was a very nascent field. So that whole realm of biomechanics, which was sort of the way that, pacifist mechanical engineers could find a direction, it didn't exist, right? And so, I joined the Peace Corps, and I taught in the Kalahari Desert and became the regional beekeeping officer. But I had in my mind this idea of teaching the class that I wish would have been there when I was at MIT, because I knew I was not the only person at MIT who wanted to work on this type of problem, but it was very difficult. And so that was really the underlying mission of D-Lab when we got started. And I'm happy to say that we now have about 5% of the MIT student population takes our classes. We have, offer more than 20, we have 20 different classes that we offer at various times. We have research programs, et cetera, with this idea of teaching the class I really wanted to take as an undergraduate. And it turns out lots of undergraduates want to take that class as well. And we, whenever there's a new interest, whether it's in biodiversity or energy or health, we create new classes. John was actually one of the first instructors of the D-Lab Schools project, looking at how can we use building technology to improve the quality of the educational experience in schools in the developing world. So I believe that there is a definite appetite for it. I do believe that it was something of a struggle the whole way, but an important struggle. And I think people like Adi are, a great testament to the need for it and the awesomeness that is produced by it. So that's, I would, and anything D-Lab can do to support other, design universities in creating that space, because students want to create things that they feel have value in the world. And while they could, if in mechanical engineering, move a block up an inclined plane, or in design, they could create a better way that we could do recycling in our classrooms. There are things that have a deeper impact than that, and I think students are thirsty for it. That's my long-winded response to your question.
That's awesome. And we learned that you were the regional beekeeper administrator. Did I get the title right?
Yes, I was. That is correct. The regional beekeeping officer of Ngamiland district.
Yeah.
A better job you won't find, by the way.
But I think, just to add to that, I think what I'm seeing specifically across the continent is it's almost a bit of a rebirth of design. There's this necessity which leads to people just getting and doing stuff, like building a generator to, we're not going to wait. We're just going to make a plan right now. And then, they often talk about Africa being a sandbox where we can actually just innovate and try things out. We don't get bogged down by all the compliance. That stretcher, I don't know if it was, probably didn't dream of an ISO standard, and where your fingers might get caught, but they don't care. They just build it and make it. And so I think you see almost immediate impact happening, which has been, in some ways, I think in the rest of the world, this gets bogged down. A lot of design innovation is just bogged down by bureaucracy, and we can no longer just fiddle and make and try things, and therefore the impact is only maybe seen, or maybe it's never seen. So I think this opportunity I haven't seen in the continent is this sort of rapid iteration of ideas, which leads to quicker impact, specifically to human beings and the people around the challenge.
That's great. I'd love to get to open up to the floor. I just have to say how fun it is to be here with the four of you. So can we hear a round of applause for this panel and how they did? Okay. So we do have passed microphones. So are there any questions or comments from the floor? Please. I saw your hand go up first. Then you're second, just there.
Hello, I'm Shivali, currently doing my master's in graphic design and visual experience from SCAD. So the question I have for you is, so I'm from India, and I struggle to explain what I do because most of them think that they ask me to stitch their clothes because they don't know what is design. And even if I do take my time explaining it, it's not valued the same way that I may view and value design. And this thought is prevalent in a lot of third world countries where people may not, see the value in design. So when you're working with such communities, and want them to participate in your projects, or how does it fit in your framework when working with such communities with such perspective of design?
Anyone want to take that?
I have a quick answer, which is bring a corn sheller. No, but so my initials are ABS, and I say that it stands for always bring stuff. And I think the answer to that question is show simple designs that that people can relate to, that are relevant to their lives, that they see the power of how something new and innovative can impact their lives immediately, and that it's not, it's something that was designed and created, and they could see themselves designing and creating it, or they could see you designing it and creating it. So having a collection of these, samples, and if you're in health, you can have health technologies. If you're in agriculture, you can have agricultural technologies. But there exist these small, powerful pieces of stuff that allow you to show the value and impact of design. So that's what I always do. Is we have little devices that make charcoal briquettes out of waste agricultural material, a variety of things that people can see. Wow, I want to learn this process because I want to be able to do that. And not only that, I have these other challenges I'd like to address.
So I want to get to as many questions as we can, but any other quick comments?
I have a real quick one. I was going to say, I think I agree that awareness is huge because, like, a brief story from when I was in Ghana, one of the female interns on the team, her name was Shedika, told me she didn't even know that engineering was a career that she could have in Ghana until she was 22 and in college. So it's like just bringing these things up as a conversation, I think also does a whole lot in like what can engineering do or what can these design things do to like, yeah.
Okay, I saw two other hands, one here and then one at the back. I think you had your hand up, yes?
Thank you for inspiring presentations. While I was watching it, I was looking around and comparing this context to that context that I was seeing through the images. And although you mentioned that there are resources there, I could not think that, well, here there are a lot more resources. And most of these resources somehow came from there, right? Because there's an international trade that generates all that social inequality that's behind it. And of course, that traces back to histories of centuries of colonialism, and international development is definitely a continuation, although there's a lot more self-criticism on not trying to repeat the same colonial relationships. And I wonder, design, of course, does not hold the power of changing or reverting international trade relationships as quickly as possible as, you build a prototype. It's not as simple like that, right? But within that history, is it enough repair to somehow export design thinking or other ways of creative capacity building, of other ways how these communities can become more resilient or they can design by themselves? Does that work as a repair for all the histories and centuries of, international resource exploitation and also labor exploitation as part of colonial processes?
Sure. Anyone?
Well, that's an easy one.
Easy way, he said. Sorry.
I have some thoughts, and I think I can say more neutrally because I'm an implant myself here from India. So I think I've constantly wondered about, just the basic question of like why is everything so much more expensive here than it is back home, right? Like everything's at least like 10 times what it costs to get done. And like it is because of like regulations, requirements, and I think I've come to frame it as like more human dignity, like recognizing processes over here. So anytime a human touches something, there is a cost attached to that, right? Back home, we don't tend to think of human resource with the cost attached in that strong way. I think by bringing back some of these ideas of design thinking, but in parallel to really understanding the fabric of the community there, coming as a knowledge bearer, I think is problematic. Coming as a listener is really empowering when you want to understand that local context and work with that, right? I think that's where there is some space for meaningful like bridging and reparation.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can just add to that. I mean, specifically in South Africa, there's a strong movement around decolonization of curricula and knowledge, and bringing indigenous knowledge into the system. And that's a transformation we're going through. In fact, the whole of South Africa and a number of other African countries as well. So I think we're starting that journey, and I think development aid and things needs to shift into a different paradigm in that as well. And in some ways, the funding that has come into South Africa now to start this D school is a different type of funding. It's very experimental. And say, let's try this out, and let's try a different way of capacitating and teaching and skilling and getting people and bringing indigenous knowledge into local design, with no hard metrics at the end, other than let's try something different. So we definitely are seeing a shift. I think we've got a long way to go. A lot of the vocabulary, a lot of the tools, a lot of the techniques are still very much global north. And part of the work that we're starting to do now is to work across with the continent with other African institutions to try and bring in their knowledge as well and co-create a narrative, which will hopefully start to shift. And then export that in a way where the rest of the world, I mean, the complexity, the challenges, the diversity that Africa has. And if you look at the future and the youth population, it's going to be a global player in 10, 15, 20 years' time. But I don't think we're there yet. I think we've still got a long way to go.
Yes, we have a question at the back. Kathleen.
Hi, yes, my name is Kathleen. I wanted to actually piggyback off that last question and also about some of the comments made about like Africa being a sandbox for innovation and being able to kind of avoid being bogged down by bureaucracy, because I think there's a real responsibility to have the principles to keep in check what problems that design or even the idea of exporting something can create, because things are never exported one-to-one. Just a few weeks ago, the speaker at Harvard's commencement, Maria Ressa, was talking about the exportation of Facebook algorithms that disrupted the 2016 election in the Philippines and really threatened democracy in a lot of ways. And I'm curious what design's role now when we think about these new forms of international collaboration, co-partnership, co-design. What are the measures that you're taking to make sure that you're not replicating these same forms of harm?
Thank you. Anyone want to tackle that? Related question. Also, yeah, I feel like I have a related, Go ahead. Okay. Sure. I feel like you bring up a very interesting point, because an interesting discussion I had with somebody while I was in country is the role of NGOs, especially large NGOs that come into countries and like try to solve problems. And nothing against them; they're doing a lot of good work. But an interesting conversation having people in one of the schools there was that NGOs are actually the bad guy, because a lot of the time, if you think about the history, when the United Nations was set up, you had a lot of these countries that were historically colonizers who did a lot of things to these developing world contexts and are now setting up organizations to then come in and save these developing world contexts from things that they just did to them, right? So one of the interesting conversations we were having was the importance of like investing in local talent and local entrepreneurship as opposed to these like nonprofit solutions that usually come in, because whatever solution we're finding in design, it's really important to help like boost local economy and empower local individuals and help them create self-sustaining businesses, almost like not more, but at least as important as actually solving the problem that community is facing.
Yeah, maybe I can add one of the things that we've done as we've sort of evolved with our creative capacity building program is to work through the context of developing local innovation ecosystems. And I think that follows on to what you were talking about, where, as you know, they learn to design a technology, but following that, they learn how do they take that technology and turn it into a livelihood. And how can one group of innovators help other people within the communities innovate, et cetera. So I think this idea of local innovation ecosystems is a very powerful one. And it's tricky because funding organizations, they often, and you spoke to this, right? It's unpredictable what the outcome of design is, right? And I always say to people who I'm training to become design facilitators, the most important thing to have is faith, right? Faith in the people and faith in the process. And people will develop good and useful things, but you just don't know what they are. And so when a funding organization says, you know, well, what will these people create? And I'm like, I don't know, whatever they want. It's not a compelling answer, but it should be, right? Shouldn't that be the best answer to that question? That people will create what they want and what they need. And that's much better than some external organization coming in and doing a needs assessment and deciding what people want. But a lot of organizations aren't there yet. And so I feel like, you know, what can we do about that? Well, I think we can try to stand firm in trying to make clear how very valuable it is to have that faith in people to create what they need and what is useful in their lives, and not try to take on a paternalistic role to decide what it is that people need and how they should go about getting it. And, you know, there are not many NGOs who follow that paradigm because they are so tied to funding, et cetera. So it does require, you know, I guess design thinking in terms of the, how do you get the approach to take wings? And I think that, you know, to have an institution which is actually formed, you know, the basis of your foundation is this idea of introducing design thinking and design as a problem-solving mechanism in both South Africa and throughout Africa. I mean, that's a huge step, right? And so the fact that there's at least one funding organization that's looking at that with value, and there are more, but I do think that it is constantly pushing back against these sort of forces that are trying to continue with these neo-colonial ideas that, you know, people with a formal design education know better what designs are needed, you know. And so, and then what comes with that is humility, and to recognize that although I have a extensive training in design, I still am, you know, I'm not from Ghana, and, you know, and my job is to train Ghanaians to design, not to design for Ghanaians.
We're just about at time, and I'm looking around the room. Maybe there, I saw your hand go up first. Yeah, right in front of Marion, right there. Yeah, first. Last question.
Hopefully it will be a quick question because it's actually piggybacking on the last two questions, but also something that was mentioned here. So I think it was Amy, you had a slide about kind of like showing, you know, there's a design for, with, by. And Richard mentioned something about, you know, vocabulary. And that got me thinking, so what would be the final step? Because even, you know, with the slide where it said by, what I noticed, conversation was about making a space at the table for the local communities. It's still assuming that there isn't like an existing table. And whether we, you know, here, you know, at prestigious places like MIT or like even UCT, like, why is it that we have to show them, now that they have a place at the table, why aren't we asking ourselves, you know, why do we even have that, right? And I guess my question is, so vocabulary, what would be the next step, right? Because I feel like by is a good goal, but I don't think that really is, I don't think it will get us to a place where it's truly decolonized, where we truly, you know, we help where we can. Maybe it's more about funding. It seems the resources are there. People,
Yeah.
I mean, these people are resilient. They have ideas, right? So I was just wondering, like, any ideas on what would be the next step, evolution of the buy?
Could I just start with some clarification, and sorry if this wasn't clear, but the table was a design with table, not a design by table. So the idea is that the design buy doesn't need a table, right? People are creating for themselves. They make things, you teach the design process, and they may collaborate with other people, but they choose to make their own table. Or actually the girls from South Sudan made their own stools so that they wouldn't have to sit on the ground at the design training. But that is within that paradigm. The table analogy was really more for when you're doing design with. How can you be sure that if you are bringing together diverse stakeholders, that those stakeholders are coming with a more level playing field background, ability to contribute. So I just wanted to clarify that before going on, because I do think the idea of a local innovation ecosystem is that you just create the ability for people to create, and then you're out of the picture. Robert Chambers used to say that you have to change the paradigm from involving people in your project to maybe helping with their project, right? So having that big paradigm shift where you don't have ownership, you might be able to help in some small way. Anyway, so I just wanted to bring that up for clarity's sake before giving other people a chance to answer.
We are over time, but if anyone else wants to add anything, I mean, for me personally, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think the funding mechanisms and metrics definitely have to change. And the advantage of the funding that we have, it's very experimental. It's let's try stuff out and see what emerges. And if you're in an environment anywhere on the continent and there's a challenge and there's a local community and you say, here's a challenge, you sort it out. They'll sort it out. They'll make a plan. They don't need any of our help. But what they might need is a bit of an enabling environment and a few resources, but it must be unconditional and let them work it out. And I think that's the key. But that changes, that's a whole different funding mechanism that has to come with that and paradigm shift. But certainly Africa doesn't need the Western methods to solve their problems. They can do it themselves, absolutely. And that's what we're seeing. We're just trying to build it. We're just trying to build up that confidence more and more so that it's in every student that leaves the university that they can help themselves and not wait for somebody to come with a solution.
Okay, I think with that, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking all of the panelists. Thank you.